there is a question that has quietly haunted psychologists, philosophers, historians, and ordinary people alike for more than half a century. It is not a complicated question. It does not require a degree in science or philosophy to understand, but it is one of the most unsettling questions a human being can sit with, because the honest answer forces you to confront something about yourself that you would much rather leave undisturbed. The question is this: if someone in authority told you to hurt an innocent person, not a criminal, not an enemy, just an ordinary, blameless stranger, would you do it? Your first instinct is probably to say no. Of course not. You are a decent person. You have a conscience. You would push back. You would walk away. You would refuse. But here is what the science actually says: you might not. Not because you are cruel. Not because you are weak. Not because you are broken in some fundamental way, but because you are human. And being human means you carry, wired somewhere deep inside the architecture of your social brain, a powerful tendency to defer to authority, a tendency so deeply embedded, so quietly automatic, so remarkably easy to trigger that even the most confident, most morally certain people are not immune to it. This is the story of one of the most famous and most controversial psychological experiments ever conducted. It is the story of a researcher named Stanley Milgram, a basement laboratory at Yale University, and a device that was never actually turned on, but that revealed something so profound about human nature that the world has been trying to make sense of it ever since. But before we get to the laboratory, before we get to the electrodes and the voltage dials and the actor strapped into a chair, let us start somewhere more familiar. Let us start with you. Picture yourself on an ordinary Tuesday morning. You are not in a laboratory. You are not being studied. You are simply going about your day. You are at work, perhaps, or in school, or sitting at a meeting table across from someone whose title or position gives them a certain kind of gravity in the room. They make a request. The request feels slightly off to you. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously illegal, just slightly against the grain of what you believe to be right. Maybe they ask you to leave out a piece of information in a report. Maybe they push you to approve something you are not fully comfortable with. Maybe they ask you to stay silent when you know speaking up would be the better thing to do. What do? Most of us, in that moment, feel a very specific kind of internal tension. On one side, there is the voice of conscience, quiet, personal, rooted in your values. On the other side, there is the weight of authority, institutional, social, seemingly rational. And in that moment, with both voices pulling in different directions, most of us do not dramatically refuse. We do not stand up and deliver a speech. We do not flip the table and storm out of the room. We hesitate. We rationalize. We tell ourselves it is not that serious. We tell ourselves that the person in charge probably knows something we do not. We tell ourselves we will say something next time, and then we do what we are asked. That small, almost invisible surrender, that is what Stanley Milgram was studying, and what he found changed everything we thought we knew about morality, courage, and the human capacity for harm. In 1961, a young psychologist at Yale University began recruiting ordinary volunteers for what was advertised as a simple memory study. Housewives, teachers, engineers, postal workers, people from all walks of life responded to a newspaper advertisement offering a modest payment for their participation. They arrived at the laboratory not knowing what they were truly about to experience. What happened next would send ripples through psychology, ethics, history, and philosophy that we still feel today. Milgram was not actually studying memory. He was studying obedience. And what he discovered was that under the right conditions, with the right authority structure in place, the vast majority of ordinary people would administer what they believed to be increasingly severe electric shocks to an innocent stranger, simply because a man in a white lab coat told them to continue. Not soldiers, not criminals, not psychologically disturbed individuals, ordinary people, people just like you and me. That finding has never stopped being disturbing. And it was never meant to stop being disturbing, because the discomfort it produces is precisely the point. The discomfort is the beginning of wisdom. So over the course of this journey together, we are going to do something that requires both intellectual honesty and personal courage. We are going to look at what Milgram actually found. We are going to understand why ordinary people obey authority, not just in laboratories, but in offices, in schools, in families, in governments, in every social structure human beings have ever built. And then we are going to ask the harder question: what do we do about it? How do we preserve the healthy, necessary functions of authority and social order while cultivating the kind of moral awareness and independent judgment that prevents ordinary people from causing extraordinary harm? Because the purpose of understanding obedience is not to become permanently suspicious of every authority figure you encounter. Rules matter, institutions matter, leadership matters. But understanding the psychology of compliance, understanding what happens inside us when we follow, is one of the most important tools a thinking person can possess. Let us begin. To understand why Stanley Milgram designed his experiment the way he did, you need to understand what was happening in the world in the years before he walked into his laboratory at Yale. The early 1960s in the United States existed in the long, troubled shadow of the Second World War. 18 years had passed since the Allied forces liberated the Nazi death camps. 18 years since the world had seen photographic evidence of what had been done to millions of human beings at the direction of a government, carried out by ordinary citizens, not monsters, not aberrations, but clerks and soldiers and railway workers and administrators who had gone home each evening to their families. The question that haunted the psychological community, and indeed much of the civilized world, was not primarily about the men at the top. It was about everyone else, about the people who had followed orders, about the people who had known, or half known, or willfully not known, and had still complied. What had happened inside those people? What psychological mechanism had allowed ordinary human beings to participate in, or silently enable, something so catastrophically wrong? Then, in 1961, while Milgram was beginning his research, a trial began in Jerusalem that placed this question at the center of global attention. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, had been captured by Israeli intelligence and was standing trial for crimes against humanity. What struck observers most was not that Eichmann appeared to be a monster. What struck them was how unremarkable he seemed. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, reporting on the trial, coined a phrase that would enter the vocabulary of the 20th century: the banality of evil. She described Eichmann not as a demon, but as a bureaucrat, a man who had, by his own account, simply been doing his job, following orders, working within a system. Whether Arendt's characterization of Eichmann was fully accurate has been debated ever since. But the broader question she raised: The question Milgram was simultaneously trying to answer in his laboratory was real and urgent. Is the capacity for obedience, driven harm something that belongs only to certain kinds of people, people with particular pathologies or cultural vulnerabilities? Or is it something more widely distributed? Is it, in some sense, a feature of ordinary human psychology? Milgram designed his experiment to find out. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. When a participant arrived at the laboratory, they were introduced to another person they believed to be a fellow volunteer, but who was actually an actor working with Milgram's team. Through a rigged drawing, the real participant was always assigned the role of the teacher, while the actor was assigned the role of the learner. The learner was then led to an adjoining room, strapped into a chair and attached to electrodes. The teacher was seated in front of a large shock generator, a professional-looking piece of equipment with 30 switches ranging from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, labeled simply XXX. The experiment appeared to be about memory and learning. The teacher would read pairs of words through a microphone. The learner would try to remember them. And every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage by 15 volts with each mistake. Here is the crucial fact, the fact that everything else depends on. No real shocks were ever delivered. The actor in the adjoining room was not actually being hurt, but the teacher in the room, the real participant, did not know this. To them, this was real. The shocks were real. The suffering was real. And the machine in front of them looked authoritative and genuine. As the voltage levels climbed, the learner's responses, pre-recorded and played through the wall, escalated from grunts to protests to screams. At 75 volts, the learner began to moan. At 150 volts, he demanded to be let out of the experiment. At 285 volts, he let out what Milgram described as an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he stopped responding altogether. When participants hesitated, when they expressed doubt, when they turned to the experimenter and said they did not want to continue, the experimenter, calm, businesslike, dressed in a gray lab coat, responded with a set of pre-scripted verbal prods. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Milgram had predicted that only a small percentage of participants, perhaps 1 or 2 in 100, would administer the highest voltage. He had polled Yale psychology students and psychiatrists before conducting the study, and they had estimated that roughly 3% of participants would go all the way to the maximum shock level. The actual result was stunning. Approximately 65% of participants, 2 out of every 3 ordinary people, administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Not because they were cruel, not because they were indifferent. Milgram recorded signs of extreme distress in the participants throughout the experiment. They sweated, they trembled, they laughed nervously, a reflex of anxiety, not pleasure. Some pleaded with the experimenter to stop. Some demanded to know whether the learner was all right. But when the experimenter told them to continue, most of them continued. The ethical controversy that followed the publication of Milgram's findings was enormous and has never fully subsided. Critics argued that Milgram had deceived his participants, exposed them to significant psychological distress, and potentially caused lasting harm. These were legitimate concerns, and they contributed to the development of much stricter ethical guidelines for psychological research that remain in place today. Milgram himself followed up with his participants after the study was concluded, conducted debriefing sessions, brought in psychiatrists to assess long-term effects, and maintained that the vast majority of participants, in retrospect, believed the study had been worthwhile and that they were glad to have participated. But the ethical debate, while important, does not diminish the scientific significance of what Milgram discovered. And what he discovered was subsequently replicated and refined across dozens of studies in different countries, with different cultural contexts, with methodological variations designed to address the critiques of his original design. The core finding that ordinary people are capable of inflicting harm on others when directed to do so by an authority figure within a legitimate, seeming institutional context, has proven to be remarkably robust. That finding demands explanation, and the explanation begins not with the experiment itself, but with the architecture of the human social brain. Human beings are, by nature and by necessity, social animals. We did not evolve to live alone. We evolved to live in groups, and life in groups requires structure. It requires some mechanism for organizing behavior, resolving conflict, coordinating action, and making collective decisions. Authority, the institutionalized capacity of some individuals to direct the behavior of others, is one of the oldest and most universal human inventions. Every society that has ever existed has developed some form of it. The socialization process through which human beings learn to function within these authority structures begins almost from birth. From the moment we enter the world, we are in a relationship with people who have power over us: parents, caregivers, older siblings. We learn very early that compliance with the wishes of those people tends to produce positive outcomes: safety, warmth, approval, belonging. And non-compliance tends to produce negative outcomes: conflict, disapproval, isolation, punishment. By the time a child enters school, the basic lessons of obedience are already deeply embedded. Listen to your teacher, follow the rules, respect your elders, stay in your seat, raise your hand. These instructions are not in themselves bad. They are part of how children learn to function in organized social environments. But they also represent the early reinforcement of a psychological tendency that, without awareness and cultivation, can operate well below the level of conscious choice. Psychologist Stanley Milgram himself identified several key psychological mechanisms that help explain why people obey authority, even when doing so conflicts with their values. The first and perhaps most powerful of these mechanisms is what Milgram called the agentic state. In normal day-to-day functioning, a person operates in what he called an autonomous state, making their own decisions, taking personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions, using their own judgment as the primary guide. But when a person enters a hierarchical system, when they become part of an organization, an institution, an authority structure, they tend to shift into a different psychological mode. In the agentic state, a person comes to see themselves not as an independent agent, but as an instrument of the authority above them. Their sense of personal responsibility diminishes. They are not deciding, they are executing. They are not choosing, they are following. The moral weight of what is being done shifts in their perception from themselves to the authority who instructed them. This shift is not irrational. In many contexts, it is actually functional and appropriate. when a surgeon operates within a hospital system, when a soldier follows battlefield commands, when an engineer executes a design specification handed down by a senior colleague. The agentic state allows complex, coordinated action to happen efficiently. The problem arises when the authority giving instructions is wrong, or corrupt, or simply mistaken, and the person in the agentic state has no psychological mechanism in place to recognize and respond to that wrongness. A second mechanism is the legitimacy of authority. Human beings are acutely sensitive to signals of legitimate authority: credentials, titles, uniforms, institutional affiliations, the trappings of expertise and status. These signals function as cognitive shortcuts. Rather than independently evaluating every instruction we receive, we use the apparent legitimacy of the source as a proxy for the trustworthiness of the instruction. This makes sense in most situations. A doctor wearing scrubs in a hospital, a police officer in uniform, a professor in an academic setting. These people typically do have relevant expertise, and their instructions typically are trustworthy. The cognitive shortcut is usually efficient and accurate, but the shortcut can be exploited. When an authority figure appears legitimate, when they dress appropriately, speak confidently, operate within an institutional context, we tend to extend them a degree of trust that may not be warranted. In Milgram's laboratory, the gray lab coat and the institutional authority of Yale University signaled legitimacy so powerfully that participants continued administering shocks, even when their own moral instincts were screaming at them to stop. A third mechanism is the gradual escalation of commitment. The shocks in Milgram's experiment did not begin at 450 volts. They began at 15. Each step was small. Each increment was modest. And with each small step, the participant became slightly more committed to the path they were on. Psychologists call this the foot in the door phenomenon. Once a person has agreed to a small request, they are significantly more likely to agree to a larger one. The principle of consistency, our deep-seated desire to behave in ways that align with our previous behavior, makes it psychologically costly to reverse course midway through a process. To stop at 300 volts is, in some sense, to admit that everything up to 300 volts was also wrong. And that is a difficult admission to make. A fourth mechanism is diffusion of responsibility. In many institutional contexts, responsibility is spread across multiple people, multiple roles, multiple levels of a hierarchy. This distribution of responsibility creates a situation where no single person feels fully accountable for the outcome. In Milgram's experiment, this appeared clearly. When participants were told that the experimenter would take responsibility for whatever happened to the learner, their rates of compliance increased. When they felt that the responsibility was not theirs to bear, when they were, in a sense, just the hands executing someone else's will, they found it easier to continue. There is also the factor of social proof and normalization. When people around us behave in a certain way, or when the behavior we are being asked to perform appears to be normal and expected within a given context, we are much more likely to engage in it ourselves. The institutional framing of Milgram's experiment, the professional environment, the calm demeanor of the experimenter, the presentation of shock administration as a routine part of a legitimate scientific procedure, all function to normalize what was, in reality, deeply abnormal behavior. And finally, there is the factor of physical and psychological distance from consequences. When we cannot directly see or feel the impact of our actions, when the suffering is behind a wall, or in a distant office, or at the end of a chain of institutional steps that we are only a small part of, it becomes much easier to continue acting in ways that we might not, if confronted with the immediate reality of the harm we are causing. This is why Milgram found that obedience rates decreased significantly when the learner was placed in the same room as the teacher, and decreased even further when the teacher was required to physically hold the learner's hand to the shock plate. Proximity to human suffering activates empathy. Distance diminishes it. Now let us leave the laboratory and enter a story. Marcus had always considered himself a reasonable man. He arrived at work each morning 7 minutes early, never more and never less, because that was the kind of precision he believed life rewarded. He made his coffee at his desk. A French press, black, no sugar, reviewed his calendar and began the day with a quiet, methodical discipline that had served him well through 12 years at the consulting firm. He had joined the firm fresh out of graduate school, full of ideas about the kind of work he wanted to do and the kind of professional he wanted to become. He believed in rigor. He believed in honesty. He believed that good consulting meant telling clients the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Especially when it was uncomfortable. That was the value you provided. That was what distinguished a trusted advisor from a person who simply confirmed whatever the client already believed. In the early years, he had held to this belief fairly easily. His work was relatively junior, his projects relatively small, and his managers had seemed, for the most part, to share his values. He had not had many occasions to test his principles, but 12 years changes things. 12 years of small accommodations, small adjustments, small moments of choosing not to push back. These had accumulated into a pattern that Marcus, if he was being truly honest with himself, would have found difficult to recognize as the work of the person he had intended to become. It had started, as these things often do, with something that seemed entirely reasonable. Marcus was 3 years into his career when his direct manager, a polished and decisive woman named Sandra, asked him to revise a client presentation. The revision was minor. A few slides adjusted, some language softened around a conclusion that the analysis had supported clearly, but that the client, Sandra explained, was unlikely to receive well. Marcus had felt something twitch inside him when he read the revision request. The softened language did not exactly say something false, but it no longer said what the data clearly showed. It hedged. It equivocated. It created just enough ambiguity that the client could interpret the conclusion in whichever direction they preferred. He had almost raised the concern. He had written the email, actually typed the words, "Sandra, I want to flag something about the revision." But then he had looked at the request again, at Sandra's tone, professional, matter of fact, as if the revision were simply a normal part of the process, and he had deleted the draft. She was experienced. She knew the client. She presumably had reasons for the adjustment that went beyond what Marcus could see from his vantage point. He sent the revised slides. Nothing bad happened. The client was pleased. Sandra mentioned his name positively in a partner meeting the following week. And the twitch he had felt when reading the revision request faded into the background noise of a busy week. That is how it works. When it works quietly, it does not announce itself. It does not present itself as a moral compromise. It presents itself as pragmatism, as professional judgment, as the appropriate deference of someone who is still learning to someone who knows more. And because the consequences are rarely immediate or obvious, the accommodation is made and then remembered, if it is remembered at all, not as a failure of integrity, but as an example of professional adaptability. Over the following years, there were more revisions, more softened conclusions, more occasions when a project's findings were shaped, not by what the data showed, but by what the client hoped to hear or what the partners believed the relationship required. Marcus participated in all of it. He told himself each time that he was operating within normal professional boundaries, that all consulting involved a degree of client management, that there was no meaningful difference between presenting the truth and presenting the truth in a way that preserved the client relationship. He also told himself that it was not his call, that his role was to execute the work as directed, that the partners, the people with real authority, real accountability, real understanding of the business, were the ones making the strategic judgments. His job was to do his job. And then there was the quarterly review meeting. Marcus had led the team on a project that had consumed 6 months of intensive work. The client was a mid-sized manufacturing company struggling with declining margins and looking for strategic clarity. Marcus's team had done what he considered some of the best analysis of his career. Careful, thorough, honest work that had surfaced a genuine structural problem in the client's supply chain and identified a set of solutions that, while requiring significant short-term investment, would likely produce substantial long-term improvements. The partner leading the engagement, a man named Richard, whose client relationships were, by all institutional measures, the firm's most valuable, reviewed the final materials the night before the presentation. He called Marcus at 11 o'clock in the evening and said, calmly and without apparent discomfort, that the presentation needed to change. Not the underlying analysis, that could stay, but the recommendations needed to be reordered, the risk assessments needed to be reduced, and the section about structural challenges needed to be moved to an appendix. The client, Richard explained, was sensitive to anything that implied a criticism of decisions made under his predecessor's tenure, which the structural problem clearly did. The message needed to be positioned differently. Marcus sat with his phone in his hand after Richard hung up, looking at the wall of his home office. He knew what Richard was asking. He knew, with a clarity he had rarely felt in 12 years of professional life, that the presentation Richard wanted was not the same as the presentation the data supported, that the client would leave the meeting without a clear picture of what their business actually needed, that the firm would be paid for analysis that had, in the most important sense, been hidden. He revised the slides. He came in early the next morning and rebuilt the narrative structure in the way Richard had outlined. The presentation went smoothly. The client was appreciative. Richard was pleased. Marcus drove home that evening feeling hollowed out in a way he could not quite explain to anyone and did not try to. What Marcus was experiencing, that hollowness, that particular flatness that follows a moral capitulation you have managed to talk yourself into, is something that a great many people have experienced in a great many professional contexts without necessarily having a name for what it was. It is the experiential residue of the agentic state, the feeling of having been, for a period of time, not fully yourself. Not the self that holds values and makes judgments, but the self that executes, performs, accommodates, and tells itself that this is what professional life requires. What Marcus did not do, not at any of the significant moments over those 12 years, was pause long enough to ask himself the question that would have made all the difference. Not whether he was following instructions, not whether he was being a good team player, not whether his manager had reasons he couldn't fully see. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those. The question is, do I actually believe this is right? Not professionally right, not politically right, not strategically right, just right. Would I be comfortable if the people whose judgment I most respect could see exactly what I am doing and why? That question, asked honestly and early, changes the calculation. It does not always produce easy answers or comfortable outcomes, but it returns agency to the person asking it. And without agency, without that fundamental sense of oneself as a moral actor rather than a component in a system, integrity becomes not a set of choices but a set of rationalizations. Now let us turn to the question that follows naturally from all of this. If obedience is so deeply rooted, so powerfully conditioned, so reliably triggered by legitimate, seeming authority structures, what does it actually take to resist? What is moral courage, and how is it cultivated? The first thing to understand about moral courage is that it is not the absence of fear or doubt. It is action taken in the presence of fear or doubt. Every person who has ever stood up against pressure, who has ever said no when the entire social environment around them was saying yes, who has ever insisted on a principle when insistence carried real costs. Every one of those people felt afraid, felt uncertain, felt the pull of conformity and the lure of accommodation. Moral courage is not the elimination of that pull. It is the decision to act despite it. Psychologists who study resistance to unethical authority have identified several factors that distinguish people who refuse from people who comply. And importantly, these factors are not fixed personality traits that you either have or you do not. They are capacities that can be developed, practiced, and strengthened over time. One of the most significant is a strong and explicit sense of personal identity and values. People who are clearest about who they are and what they stand for, who have thought deliberately about their principles, articulated them, and tested them against real situations, are better able to notice when a requested behavior conflicts with those principles. The conflict is not hidden from them by the fog of authority and institutional context. They feel it more quickly, more clearly, and more urgently. Not because they are more virtuous than others, but because they have done the cognitive work of knowing themselves. This might seem abstract, but it has practical implications. Thinking carefully about your values, not when you are under pressure, but before you are, when you have the space and the calm to reflect honestly, is not a trivial or self-indulgent exercise. It is one of the most practically useful things a person can do to strengthen their capacity for moral courage. The person who, when asked to do something wrong, can immediately locate a clear, prior commitment that the request violates. That person is in a very different psychological position than the person who must reason through their values from scratch, under pressure, in the moment. A second factor is what researchers call psychological safety in the prior relationship with authority. People are significantly more likely to express disagreement or dissent when they have a history of being heard. When they believe, based on experience, that raising a concern will not result in catastrophic consequences, This suggests something important about the environments in which moral courage thrives. It is not only a property of individuals, but of relationships and organizational cultures. Leaders who want ethical organizations are not simply asking for employees who have stronger characters. They are asking for, and must actively create, environments in which honest feedback is welcomed, not punished. A third factor is the availability of a reference group that shares the person's values. In Milgram's experiment, obedience rates dropped dramatically when participants were paired with a peer who refused to continue. In one variation of the study, when two Confederates acting as fellow teachers expressed reluctance and ultimately withdrew from the experiment, the real participants' rate of full compliance dropped from 65% to only 10%. 10%. The power of a single dissenting voice, of a single fellow human being who names what is wrong, is extraordinary. You do not need a majority. You do not need institutional sanction. You need one person, sometimes yourself, to say clearly, this is not right. A fourth factor is what might be called moral imagination, the cultivated capacity to vividly imagine the impact of your actions on other people, to look past the institutional framing, past the professional context, past the role you are playing, and to see the actual human being who is affected by what you do. Milgram observed this himself. When the learner was physically close to the teacher, compliance dropped. The physical proximity was functioning as a stimulus for moral imagination. It was harder to administer shocks to someone you could see and hear than to someone who existed only as a voice through a wall. Cultivating this capacity, practicing the habit of asking yourself, in concrete and personal terms, what your actions actually mean for real people, is one of the most powerful tools in the development of ethical judgment. And there is one more factor, perhaps less often discussed, but enormously important: the willingness to accept short-term cost for long-term integrity. Refusing authority in the moment rarely comes without a price. The price might be discomfort, conflict, disapproval, the loss of a promotion, or the disruption of a relationship, and the person who lacks the psychological resources to tolerate that short-term cost, who has not thought through what they are willing to risk in defense of what they believe, is unlikely to pay it, however strong their values. Moral courage requires not just knowing what is right, but being willing to endure the consequences of saying so. This is where the concept of moral courage intersects with the broader question of self-knowledge. The person who has done the work of understanding what they value, who has thought carefully about what they are and are not willing to do, who has a clear sense of the costs they would accept and the lines they would not cross. That person has what might be called a moral anchor, not a rigid rule book, but a stable foundation from which to navigate genuinely difficult situations. And unlike a rule book, a moral anchor does not become useless when the situation is complex or ambiguous. It remains there, steady and available, providing orientation in exactly the moments when orientation is hardest to find. We have spoken about the laboratory and about abstract psychological mechanisms, and we have traced these forces through the story of one professional life. But authority does not only operate in laboratories and boardrooms. It operates everywhere that human beings organize themselves into groups. Which is to say, it operates everywhere. Consider the workplace, the environment where most adults spend the largest portion of their waking hours, and where the psychology of obedience is perhaps most consistently active. The hierarchy of a typical organization is a sophisticated authority structure. It distributes power according to title, tenure, and institutional function. It creates chains of command, explicit and implicit, that shape what information travels upward and what does not, whose concerns are taken seriously and whose are deflected, what kinds of questions are welcomed and what kinds are unwelcome. In the best organizations, these structures enhance collaboration, enable coordination, and create the kind of shared accountability that makes complex work possible. But in every organization, regardless of how good its culture, how thoughtful its leadership, how sincere its stated commitment to openness, the authority structure creates psychological pressures that affect the behavior of the people within it. People tell their managers what they think their managers want to hear. They underreport problems. They overreport progress. They stay silent in meetings when they disagree because they do not want to be seen as difficult or uncommitted or not a team player. These behaviors are not signs of moral failure. They are predictable, rational responses to real social pressures. But they are also, in aggregate, enormously costly to organizations, to the quality of decisions made within them, and to the individuals who suppress their genuine judgment day after day. The school is another environment where authority structures powerfully shape behavior. For children and adolescents, school is the primary institutional context in which they spend their time, and the authority of teachers, administrators, and peers exerts an enormous influence on what they think, say, and do. The lessons of school are not only academic, they are social and psychological. They teach children what it feels like to be in an institution, how to navigate authority, what the rewards of compliance are, and what the costs of non-compliance might be. When schools function well, when teachers are genuinely curious, when critical thinking is genuinely valued, when students are consistently invited to question and explore rather than simply to memorize and repeat, they are doing something profoundly important. They are building, in the next generation, exactly the capacities that Milgram's research suggests are necessary for ethical citizenship. The capacity to ask questions, the capacity to evaluate evidence independently, the capacity to hold one's own judgment alongside, rather than simply beneath, the judgment of an authority figure. But when schools function primarily as authority, compliance training grounds, when students are rewarded most consistently for following rules, producing correct answers, and reflecting back what the teacher has said, they are inadvertently reinforcing the very tendencies that make ordinary people vulnerable to unethical authority. Not because the teachers intend this, but because institutional structures tend to produce the behavior they reward, and rewarding compliance tends to produce compliant people. The family is the original authority structure, the first and most intimate context in which human beings learn about the relationship between power and love, authority and care, rules and belonging. The lessons absorbed within the family are not cognitive lessons. They are not things children think about and evaluate and decide whether to accept. They are things children feel and internalize and carry forward into every subsequent relationship and institution they encounter. Families in which authority operates thoughtfully, where rules are explained rather than just imposed, where children's perspectives are genuinely solicited and genuinely considered, where disagreement is permitted and even welcomed within appropriate boundaries, tend to produce people who are more comfortable exercising independent judgment in later life. People who have experienced, from an early age, that their voice has value, that their thinking matters. That authority and respect are not the same thing as submission, and families in which authority operates more rigidly. Where obedience is the primary expectation, where questioning is experienced as defiance, where the emotional safety of the home is contingent on compliance, tend to produce people who are more reflexively deferential, who have a harder time locating their own judgment when it conflicts with institutional expectations, and who are more vulnerable to the kinds of authority that exploit compliance for purposes of control. Beyond workplaces, schools, and families, authority structures operate in social groups of all kinds. In religious communities, in political organizations, in professional associations, in online communities, anywhere that people gather around a shared identity or purpose, authority tends to emerge. And wherever authority emerges, the psychology of obedience is in operation. The social dynamics that Milgram observed in his laboratory, the deference to legitimate, seeming authority, the gradual escalation of commitment, the diffusion of responsibility, the normalization of behavior within a group context. These are not laboratory phenomena. They are human phenomena. They appear wherever human beings organize themselves into groups with defined roles, shared norms, and recognizable hierarchies. Understanding this, not as an accusation or a source of cynicism, but as a clear-eyed map of the social landscape, is the beginning of navigating it more wisely. Now let us go deeper into the capacity that makes wise navigation possible: critical thinking. Not in the abstract, academic sense of the term, but in the practical, everyday sense. The mental habits that allow a person to question assumptions, evaluate evidence, and make independent judgments even under social pressure. The central challenge of critical thinking is that it requires effort at precisely the moments when effort is most difficult to summon. When we are under pressure, when authority is present, when the social cost of non-compliance feels high, when we are tired or stressed or simply busy. These are the moments when the pull of automatic deference is strongest, and these are also, not coincidentally, the moments when critical thinking matters most. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in his landmark work on human cognition, described two modes of mental processing that he called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, and effortless. It is the system that allows you to recognize a face, understand a sentence, and navigate a familiar route without conscious deliberation. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical, and effortful. It is the system that you engage when you are solving a complex problem, evaluating an unfamiliar argument, or making a difficult decision that requires you to hold multiple considerations in mind simultaneously. Most of the time, we operate primarily through System 1. This is not a failing, it is an adaptive efficiency. The world presents us with far more information and far more decisions than we could possibly process through deliberate, conscious analysis. System 1 handles the vast majority of it quickly and accurately enough for most purposes. But authority and social pressure exploit System 1. The signals of legitimate authority, the white coat, the professional title, the institutional affiliation, the confident manner, are processed automatically, rapidly, and without deliberate evaluation. The social cue that conformity is expected is processed automatically, rapidly, and without deliberate evaluation. The incremental nature of escalating commitment, each small step seeming so modest compared to the last, is managed by System 1. without triggering the kind of full analysis that might reveal the cumulative distance traveled from the original starting point. Critical thinking, in this context, is not a substitute for System 1. It is the cultivation of the habit of strategically engaging System 2, of deliberately pausing and analyzing at the moments that matter most, not for every decision, not for routine judgments where System 1 is perfectly adequate, but for the decisions that involve values, consequences for others, and potential conflict between what feels natural within an authority context and what actually seems right upon reflection. What does this look like in practice? It looks like developing the habit of asking certain kinds of questions, not constantly, not compulsively, but at the moments when the quality of your decision genuinely matters. What is actually being asked of me here? Not what the request sounds like, but what it actually means in concrete terms for real people. Whose interests does this serve? Who benefits from my compliance? And who bears the consequences? What would I think of this if the authority context were removed? If this were not my manager, my teacher, my religious leader, my government, but simply a stranger making the same request? Would I think it was reasonable? Would I be comfortable if the consequences of this decision were fully transparent to everyone whose opinion I respect? Is the urgency I am feeling genuine, or is it being manufactured by the situation itself, by social pressure, by time constraints, by the implicit expectations of the authority present? What am I afraid of? And is that fear a reliable guide to what is right, or is it simply a reliable guide to what is safe? These questions are not formulas. There is no script that can substitute for genuine moral reasoning. But the habit of asking them, regularly, and especially at the moments of pressure, is one of the most powerful things a person can do to maintain their own agency within the social structures they inhabit. One of the most important distinctions in critical thinking is the difference between questioning assumptions and refusing to act. These are not the same thing. The goal of developing independent judgment is not to become permanently suspicious, permanently contrary, permanently in a posture of resistance to everything that authority asks. The goal is to think clearly about what you are doing and why, so that when you do comply, you are complying because you have genuinely evaluated the request and found it reasonable, not because the social pressure to comply was simply easier to give in to. There is also the matter of how critical thinking interacts with expertise. One of the most legitimate functions of authority is the representation of genuine expertise. The fact that a cardiologist knows more about your heart than you do, that an experienced structural engineer knows more about building safety than the layperson walking past the construction site. Critical thinking is not a claim to equal expertise in all domains. It is not the refusal to defer to genuine knowledge. It is the cultivation of the capacity to distinguish between genuine expertise, appropriately represented and appropriately bounded, and the mere appearance of authority, which may or may not be backed by genuine knowledge, and which may or may not be exercised in your interest. The doctor who says this medication is the most effective treatment for your condition and explains the evidence behind that claim is exercising genuine expertise in a transparent and appropriate way. The compliance demanded in that context is different in kind from the compliance demanded by a person who simply asserts authority, dresses the part, and relies on the social psychology of obedience to secure your cooperation without engaging your judgment at all. developing the capacity to make that distinction, to recognize when deference is genuinely warranted and when it is merely being socially compelled, is at the heart of the kind of critical thinking that makes a person genuinely wise rather than simply knowledgeable. Now let us turn the lens toward leadership, because the psychology of obedience is not only a story about followers, it is equally a story about leaders. And if the followers in Milgram's experiment bear the burden of having obeyed, the experimenter who continued to instruct them to continue bears a burden of a different and in some ways heavier kind. One of the most important insights from the research on obedience is what it reveals about the responsibility of those who hold authority. The fact that people are psychologically vulnerable to authority, that they will defer, comply, and continue well past the point their own conscience would have taken them if they were acting independently, places a profound obligation on those who occupy positions of leadership to exercise that authority with extraordinary care. This is not an abstract ethical observation. It is a practical observation about how leadership actually works. The person in authority shapes not just the actions, but the moral context in which their followers operate. When a leader is explicit about their values, when they demonstrate that they mean what they say about honesty and integrity, when they create visible examples of principle, being held even when it is costly, they are doing something more than modeling good behavior. They are recalibrating the psychological environment in which everyone around them makes decisions. They are, in effect, shifting the social pressure, what feels normal, what feels expected, what feels consistent with belonging to this particular group, toward behavior that is more ethical. Conversely, when leaders say one thing and do another, when they implicitly signal that what really matters is results and that ethical concerns are acceptable casualties of that pursuit, they are also shaping the psychological environment. They are shifting the social pressure toward compliance with the unstated culture rather than the stated values, and the people around them will feel that shift and adjust accordingly, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily deliberately, but as surely as a plant turns toward available light. Psychologist Amy Edmondson's research on what she calls psychological safety has shown that the single most important factor in whether people within an organization speak up about problems, errors, and concerns is their perception of how their superiors will respond. In teams where psychological safety is high, where people believe their voice will be heard and their concerns taken seriously rather than punished, information flows freely, errors are caught early, and ethical concerns surface before they become crises. In teams where psychological safety is low, the opposite is true. Problems are concealed, errors go unreported, ethical breaches are rationalized or ignored. Not because the people in those teams are less capable or less honest than their peers, but because the authority environment has shaped their behavior in a predictable direction. What this means for leadership is that creating ethical organizations is not primarily a matter of hiring ethical individuals. Though that matters, it is not primarily a matter of articulating ethical principles, though that matters too. It is primarily a matter of creating the conditions under which ethical behavior can actually occur. Conditions in which people feel safe to say what they see, to name what is wrong, to bring difficult truths upward without fearing the consequences. This is not a soft, peripheral concern. It is the structural foundation on which everything else in an ethical organization rests. The ethical leader, then, is not the leader who simply has good values and expects their organization to reflect those values through a kind of moral osmosis. The ethical leader is the one who understands the psychology of authority, understands how powerfully it shapes behavior in both directions, and who uses that understanding to actively cultivate an environment where good judgment is protected, honest voices are valued, and the social pressure of the group runs toward integrity rather than away from it. This requires specific, concrete behaviors. It requires leaders to visibly reward dissent when it is thoughtful and well-intentioned, even when it is inconvenient. It requires them to be explicit about the distinction between professional loyalty and blind obedience, to make clear that questioning is not disloyalty and that silence is not virtue. It requires them to model the behavior they seek, to demonstrate in their own conduct that they too hold themselves accountable to the principles they articulate, that they too are subject to question and to correction. It also requires humility, a quality that is genuinely difficult to maintain in positions of authority, partly because authority systems tend to reinforce, rather than check the self-perception of those at the top. The genuinely humble leader is not the one who performs humility as a leadership brand. It is the one who has done enough honest self-reflection to know the limits of their own judgment, the conditions under which they are most likely to be wrong, and the kinds of input they most need to receive from the people around them. Now let us turn to the habits and practices that build independent judgment, not as an abstract capacity, but as a lived daily reality. The development of genuine independence of mind does not happen through a single dramatic act of refusal or a single powerful revelation. It happens incrementally through the consistent practice of small cognitive habits. Over time, build a self that is genuinely capable of standing on its own judgment. The first, and perhaps most fundamental of these habits, is what might be called the practice of intellectual exposure. Deliberately and regularly engaging with perspectives, arguments, and evidence that differ from your current beliefs. Not to abandon your beliefs at the first challenge, but to test them, to discover which of your convictions survive scrutiny and which are merely the inherited assumptions of your particular background, upbringing, and institutional context. The person whose worldview has never been seriously challenged is not actually in a position to know whether their beliefs are genuinely their own or simply the views of whoever shaped them earliest and most powerfully. This practice requires a certain kind of courage in its own right, the intellectual courage to entertain the possibility of being wrong. One of the most reliable findings in psychological research is that human beings are powerfully motivated to protect their existing beliefs. We seek information that confirms what we already believe. We interpret ambiguous evidence in the direction that fits our prior convictions. We remember arguments that support our positions more readily than arguments that challenge them. These tendencies, what psychologists call confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and the backfire effect, are universal. No one is exempt, and the person who is not aware of them is more governed by them than the person who is. Awareness of these tendencies does not eliminate them, but it does create the possibility of catching them in operation, of noticing when you are seeking confirmation rather than truth, when you are dismissing a counter-argument not because it is actually wrong, but because accepting it would be uncomfortable. That noticing, that moment of metacognitive awareness, is itself a small exercise in independent judgment, and like any capacity, it grows stronger with practice. A second habit is the practice of articulating your reasoning, explaining to yourself, clearly and explicitly, why you believe what you believe and why you are making the choices you are making. This is more demanding than it sounds. It is entirely possible to act on a belief you have never articulated, to make a choice whose rationale you have never examined, to comply with an authority whose legitimacy you have never questioned. Articulation forces evaluation. When you are required to put your reasoning into words, even privately, in writing, even just in the quiet of your own thinking, the gaps and weaknesses in that reasoning become visible in a way they cannot when reasoning remains implicit. Journaling is one practical application of this habit. Not journaling as a form of emotional processing, though that has its own value, but journaling as a tool for making your own thinking visible to yourself. Writing about decisions you have made, about the choices that are in front of you, about the situations where you feel uncertain or pressured. This externalization of internal reasoning is one of the most effective tools available for developing genuine clarity of thought. A third habit is the practice of cultivating honest relationships, specifically, relationships with people who are willing to tell you what they genuinely think, rather than what they believe you want to hear. These relationships are genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. Most social relationships operate under a set of implicit norms that discourage radical honesty. We soften our feedback, we hedge our criticisms, we choose accommodation over truth in the interest of social harmony. This is often entirely appropriate, but it means that for most people, most of the time, the feedback they receive from the people around them is filtered through those social norms in ways that make it much less useful than it could be. Finding and cultivating relationships in which genuine honesty is possible, with a mentor, a trusted colleague, a close friend who respects you enough to tell you the truth, is an investment in your own development that pays returns throughout your life. Not because such relationships are always comfortable. They are often not, but because genuine feedback from a genuinely trusted source is one of the few mechanisms through which the blind spots in your own thinking and behavior become actually visible to you. A fourth habit is the practice of what philosophers sometimes call moral imagination, regularly and deliberately thinking through the full human consequences of your choices. Not in the abstract, but concretely. Not just this decision serves the goal or this action is within policy, but who is actually affected by this? What does it actually mean for them? What would I think if I were in their position? What would someone whose judgment I deeply respect think if they could see exactly what I am doing and why? This is the habit that closes the gap that physical and psychological distance creates. When we are operating within institutions, within authority structures, within the normal flow of professional and social life, the consequences of our choices are often remote from our immediate experience. The person affected by the report we wrote, or the decision we made, or the instruction we gave or followed, they are not present in the room. Moral imagination brings them into the room. It is the cognitive practice of refusing to allow distance, institutional, physical, social, to diminish the reality of other people's humanity in the calculation of what you do. A fifth and final habit is the regular, honest practice of asking yourself, am I being true to myself, not in the self-help sense of that phrase, but in the most literal and important sense. Do my actions today, in this situation, reflect the person I genuinely intend to be? Not the person I say I intend to be in the abstract. Not the person I was 5 years ago, before a series of small accommodations accumulated into a different kind of life, but the person I would choose to be if I were making this choice freely, clearly, without the fog of authority and social pressure and the path of least resistance pulling in a particular direction. This question, asked honestly and regularly, is one of the most powerful navigational tools a human being can possess. It does not tell you what to do, but it tells you whether you are drifting. And in the drift, in the quiet, cumulative process of small accommodations and unremarked compromises, is where the most important failures of integrity typically occur. Now let us meet another character. One who faces a similar kind of pressure, but makes a different kind of choice. Adaze had worked in the planning department of the city's transport authority for 6 years. She was known, among her colleagues, as someone who was thorough, maybe occasionally too thorough. She was the person who asked the question that took the meeting an extra 20 minutes, who submitted the report with 3 additional pages of supporting analysis that no one had asked for, but that no one had ever been able to find fault with. She was not considered difficult, exactly, but she was considered, in the particular language of institutional culture, very detail-oriented. The project had been running for 18 months. It was a major infrastructure initiative, the proposed rerouting of a significant portion of the city's bus network to service a new development zone on the eastern periphery. The political pressures surrounding it were intense. The developer had strong relationships with the city council. The timeline for the project announcement had been moved up twice already, each time at the instigation of people above her director's pay grade. There was, by the time Adaze began her final review of the traffic impact assessment, a palpable institutional momentum around the project. Everyone was moving in one direction. The approval meeting was scheduled. The press release had been drafted. Adaze spent 3 evenings in her own time referencing the traffic modeling data against a set of historical commuter patterns she had pulled from the archive. And on the 3rd evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a spreadsheet open on her laptop, she found something. The modeling underpinning the assessment had used a set of baseline commuter figures from a survey conducted 4 years earlier. In the intervening years, the commuter patterns in the affected corridor had shifted significantly, a fact that was documented in the department's own quarterly monitoring reports, which she had been contributing to for 2 years and which, apparently, had not been incorporated into the traffic model. The consequence was not trivial. The rerouted bus network, as designed, would likely result in significant service degradation for approximately 12,000 daily commuters on the existing routes. The assessment did not capture this. She sat with this for a long time. She thought about the timeline. She thought about the political pressures. She thought about her director, who had a reputation for patience that had been visibly thinning as the project progressed, and who had been, at the last team meeting, very clear about the importance of the approval meeting going smoothly. She thought about the fact that she was 6 years in, that she had a mortgage, that she had never in 6 years created a significant problem for anyone above her in the hierarchy. She also thought about 12,000 people who took the bus every day and did not know that their service was about to get substantially worse, who had not been asked and were not represented in the conversation happening above her head, who were real and specific and concrete in a way that the political pressures and the institutional timeline and her director's thinning patience were also real and specific and concrete. She did not go to the press. She did not send an anonymous tip. She did not refuse to work on the project or dramatically quit. She sat down and wrote a careful, precise, professionally worded memo, 2 pages, with 3 attached appendices, documenting what she had found, how she had found it, what the data showed, and what the implications were for the assessment. She addressed it to her director. She sent it the following morning at 8:45, 12 days before the approval meeting. She then sat at her desk and waited. Her director read the memo. Then he read it again. He called Adaze into his office that afternoon, not with the impatient tension she had anticipated, but with an expression she could not immediately read. He went through her appendices slowly, asking 3 or 4 clarifying questions. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment that felt longer to Adaze than it probably was. Then he said, "This is going to delay things." And then he said, "Well done." The project was delayed by 4 months. The traffic model was corrected. The service redesign that emerged from the corrected model was more complex and more expensive, but it preserved adequate service levels on the existing routes for the commuters who depended on them. There was friction at levels above the department. There were some pointed conversations about timelines and process, but none of it touched Adaze in the direct and damaging way she had feared. What Adaze did was not heroic in the cinematic sense. She did not stand in front of a crowd and deliver a speech. She did not blow a whistle that brought down a powerful institution. She did thorough work. She followed the evidence. She wrote a careful memo, and she sent it to the person responsible for acting on it. She did not override the hierarchy. She worked within it, while refusing to let the social pressure of that hierarchy override her judgment about what the evidence showed and what the public interest required. That is what moral courage looks like in ordinary professional life. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, not requiring anyone to sacrifice their career or their relationships or their sense of belonging. Just the willingness to do the thing that you already know is right, to write the memo you already know needs to be written, to ask the question that you already know needs to be asked. Even when the institutional current is running in a direction that would make it easier and more comfortable not to. And here is what is worth noting about what happened afterward. Adaze's action did not only protect 12,000 commuters, it changed, in a small but real way, the organizational environment around her. Her director, having recognized the value of what she had done, began actively soliciting her input on other projects, specifically asking her to do the kind of careful cross-referencing that had surfaced the problem. 2 other team members, watching how the situation had resolved, became slightly more willing to raise concerns of their own that they had previously kept quiet. The small act of courage had created, in the immediate social environment of the planning department, a slightly more psychologically safe space for honest professional judgment. This is one of the least discussed but most important aspects of moral courage, its contagious quality. Not because it inspires others to dramatic action, but because it recalibrates what feels possible. When one person demonstrates that speaking up within an authority structure does not necessarily result in catastrophe. That demonstration changes the social calculation for everyone who witnesses it. The dissenting voice in Milgram's experiment reduced full compliance from 65% to 10%, not because it changed anyone's beliefs, but because it changed what was socially possible. It made refusal real in a way that had been purely hypothetical before. You are that dissenting voice in the rooms you inhabit. You may not know it. You may have no particular awareness of the effect your choices have on the people around you. But the choices you make within authority structures, whether to speak or stay silent, whether to ask the question or let it pass, whether to submit the memo or let the institutional momentum carry you past the point where submission is still easy. These choices ripple outward in ways that are real even when they are invisible to you. We have traveled a long distance from that Yale laboratory, from those gray walls and that voltage dial and the man in the white coat saying calmly, "Please continue." And we have arrived somewhere important. We have arrived at a clear-eyed understanding of what obedience actually is. Not a character flaw or a moral failing, but one of the most ancient and deeply embedded features of human social psychology. A feature that serves real and important functions. A feature that has made cooperation, civilization, and collective achievement possible. And a feature that, without awareness, without cultivation, without the deliberate development of independent judgment and moral courage, makes ordinary people capable of participating in, or silently enabling, things they would never choose if they were thinking clearly and freely. Authority has its proper place. We should not pretend otherwise. The teacher who manages a classroom, the doctor who directs a treatment plan, the engineer who supervises a construction site, the leader who sets a strategic direction. These people are exercising authority, and we are right to extend them a significant degree of deference. Without that deference, without the social capacity to work within structures larger than ourselves, we lose access to the accumulated expertise and coordinated power that make complex human achievement possible. But authority also has its limits. And those limits are not fixed by the authority itself. They are not determined by the institution, the hierarchy, the title, the white coat, the polished credentials. They are determined, in the end, by conscience, by the quiet internal voice that knows. When we are still enough and honest enough to listen, when something is wrong, when a request crosses a line, when compliance would require us to be less than the person we have chosen to be. The lesson of Milgram is not that authority is the enemy. It is that authority is powerful, more powerful than most of us like to believe, more powerful than the flattering self-image that tells us we would always resist, always refuse, always do the right thing regardless of the social pressure surrounding us. And because authority is so powerful, it requires something from us in return. It requires vigilance. It requires the willingness to pay attention to what we are being asked to do, to ask ourselves why, to imagine clearly the human consequences of our compliance, and to find the courage, when courage is required, to say not this, not me, not this time. Every generation faces this. The specific forms change, the authority structures change, the social pressures change, but the fundamental challenge does not. In every generation, in every society, in every institution that human beings build together, there are moments when the machinery of authority produces a request that conscience cannot accept. And in those moments, the measure of a person, and ultimately the measure of a society, is not whether they felt the pressure to comply. Of course they felt it. Everyone feels it. The measure is what they did with that feeling. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and spent the rest of his life thinking and writing about what he had witnessed there, observed something that has never left me. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our growth. Not freedom from pressure, not freedom from fear, not freedom from the very real costs that come with acting according to conscience in a world that does not always reward it, but freedom of choice, the irreducible human capacity to decide, in that space between stimulus and response, who we will be. What Milgram showed us is that the space can shrink. That authority, social pressure, institutional context, and the fog of legitimacy can compress that space until the person within it feels as if there is no choice at all, as if they are simply doing what the situation requires, simply following instructions, simply being a reasonable professional operating within a reasonable system. The obedience that results from that compression is not the obedience of a monster. It is the obedience of an ordinary person whose space for freedom has been closed off by forces more powerful than individual will. What we can do, what this understanding makes possible, is learn to preserve that space, to widen it, deliberately and consciously, through the habits and practices we have discussed, through the cultivation of clear values and honest self-knowledge, through the practice of moral imagination, through the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions at uncomfortable moments, through the development of relationships and communities that strengthen rather than erode our capacity for honest judgment, through the courage to be, when the moment requires it, the one voice in the room that says what needs to be said. None of this is easy. None of this is comfortable. Authority is powerful, and the social penalties for non-compliance are real. But the cost of the alternative, the cost of living in the agentic state indefinitely, of being an instrument of systems rather than an author of choices, is paid not all at once, in a dramatic moment of obvious moral failure, but slowly and quietly, in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small surrenders. In the hollowness that Marcus felt driving home after the presentation, in the distance between who you are and who you intended to be. The greatest minds are not those that never feel the pull of obedience. They are those that feel it clearly, understand it honestly, and find within themselves, in that irreducible space between stimulus and response, the freedom to choose differently, be someone who thinks, be someone who asks, be someone who does the careful work of knowing yourself well enough to recognize when the voice saying continue is the voice of wisdom, and when it is only the voice of pressure, because awareness is where everything begins, and you are already here.